The storm over the Simmeron territory wasn't just in the sky. It was in the heart of Dennis McGregor, a man who thought he'd outrun his ghosts. It was in the soul of the woman who collapsed on his doorstep, a woman running from a future far worse than any storm. She gasped 5 words that changed everything. 5 words that carried the weight of a hidden war. "Please," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind, "just take me." But as lightning split the sky, illuminating her face, Dennis saw more than a stranger. He saw a reckoning, and he knew with the chilling certainty of a gunslinger finding his mark, he was staring straight at his own destiny. The wind screamed through the ponderosa pines around Dennis McGregor's homestead. It was a wild, raw sound, the sound of a land that refused to be tamed, a place where a man lived or died by the strength of his own 2 hands and the speed of his draw. Dennis didn't even notice. He sat at his rough-hewn table, the lamplight throwing long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. He was cleaning his Colt Peacemaker. His movements were practiced, almost sacred. He knew what this weapon was for. He wasn't a lawman anymore, not for 3 years. He'd turned in his Texas Ranger badge, trading the hunt for the quiet solitude of this valley. He'd bought the land and built this cabin himself, trying to build a wall around the memories. Memories of fire, of screams, of a promise he broke to the Dorson family. He'd been too late. That failure was a brand on his soul. A horse's frantic whinny, sharp with terror, sliced through the storm. It was close. Too close. His dog, Buck, a scruffy Airedale mix, shot up from the hearth, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Dennis's hand froze. He moved with a liquid grace born from 100 dangerous nights, grabbing his slicker and the Winchester rifle from the rack by the door. Stepping outside was like walking into a solid wall of wind and water. The rain fell in sideways sheets, turning his yard into a churning sea of mud. And through the downpour, he saw it. A horse, its coat matted with sweat and mud, its sides heaving. It stood trembling, its reins hopelessly tangled in the sagebrush. Slumped over its neck was a figure, a human figure. Dennis moved forward, cautious, his boots sinking deep into the muck. The horse, a fine-boned mare, was on its last legs. He took the reins gently, his voice a low, calming murmur. That's when he got a clear look at the rider. It was a woman. Her clothes, what looked like they might have been expensive blue silk, were torn and soaked, clinging to a frame that seemed too fragile for this harsh land. Her face was turned away, hidden by a curtain of dark, wet hair. With a grunt, he eased her from the saddle. She was impossibly light in his arms. As he carried her toward the cabin, Buck sniffing nervously at her heels, she began to stir. Her head lolled back, and her eyes fluttered open. For a split second, a flash of lightning lit up the world. He saw her eyes. They were the color of deep green moss, wide with a terror so pure it felt like it could suck the air right out of your lungs. He shouldered the cabin door open and laid her gently on his cot. He stoked the fire, sending a shower of warm sparks up the chimney. When he turned back, she had pushed herself up onto one elbow. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she expected monsters to leap from the very shadows on the wall. "You're safe here," Dennis said, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes locked onto his. "He'll find me," she whispered, her voice ragged. "His men. They were right behind me." "Who's he?" Dennis asked, pulling a thick wool blanket from his trunk. She just shook her head, a single tear cutting a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She winced, trying to sit up, her hand flying to her side. He moved to gently push her back down. "Easy now. You're spent." He draped the blanket over her, his motions all business. He was a man used to dealing with necessities, not feelings. But then her hand shot out. Her fingers, surprisingly strong, clamped around his wrist. The touch was like a spark of lightning, a jolt that shattered his carefully built detachment. "Please," she begged, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "Don't send me away. Don't turn me over to them. Whatever they offer you, whatever they promise you, it's all a lie." Her grip was like iron. "Please, just take me. Hide me. I'll work. I'll cook. I'll do anything. Just don't let him take me back." It was the plea of a cornered animal. He'd seen it before. In the eyes of homesteaders about to lose everything. In the eyes of men with a noose around their neck. But this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was a burning, defiant will to live. He looked closer, past the mud in the torn dress. The lightning flashed again, a long, brilliant stroke that filled the cabin with stark white light. And in that instant, he saw her, really saw her, the proud set of her jaw, the unbroken fire in her green eyes, the faint, silvery scar that cut through one eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that spoke of a life that hadn't been easy. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter who had run out of room to run. And in that moment, something inside Dennis McGregor broke. The wall of ice around his heart cracked. It wasn't love. It was something deeper. It was recognition. He saw in her the same desperate fight for a future that he had once sworn to protect, and then abandoned. The ghosts of the Dorson family whispered in the howling wind. This time, they seemed to say, don't be too late. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this woman wasn't just a problem. She was his future. A dangerous, complicated, and possibly fatal future. He gently pried her fingers from his wrist, but he didn't let go. He held her hand in his own calloused palm. I won't turn you over, he said, and the words felt like a sacred vow. You can stay. What's your name? A wave of relief so powerful washed over her face, it seemed she might just fall apart. Lillian, she breathed, her eyes finally fluttering closed as the last of her strength gave out. Lillian Mayfair. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the small cabin, the real tempest was just beginning. Dennis looked down at the woman on his cot, then at the rifle leaning against the door. He knew the name Bartholomew Cain, a powerful rancher who ran the town of Redemption, and most of this territory, with an iron fist. A man whose reputation was merciless, and Dennis had just stepped between him and something he wanted. He had just declared war. The dawn broke clear and cold. The storm had scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Outside, the world glistened, every pine needle jeweled with moisture. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, wood smoke, and antiseptic. Lillian Mayfair awoke to the clinking of metal. Her body ached, but the gnawing terror was gone, replaced by a fragile sense of safety. She was on a narrow cot under a heavy wool blanket. A man stood with his back to her at the stove, his broad shoulders filling out a simple flannel shirt. He moved with a quiet confidence that was strangely reassuring. She remembered his face from the lightning flash, hard angles and eyes the color of a winter sky. You're awake, Dennis said without turning. There's stew on the stove. You need to eat. He brought a tin mug of coffee over to her. His hands were calloused and scarred, but his touch had been surprisingly gentle in the night when he'd cleaned the ugly gash on her ribs. He'd done it with an impersonal efficiency that left no room for fear. Thank you, she said, her voice still raw, for everything. Don't thank me yet, he replied flatly. He sat at the table watching her. Trouble finds a man easy enough in this territory. I don't usually invite it in for breakfast. I told you, I can work, Lillian said, looking down into her coffee. It's not your work I'm worried about. It's the man you're running from. Bartholomew Cain. Dennis said the name like it tasted foul. He owns the town of Redemption, the sheriff, the bank, and half the ranchers in this basin. A man like that doesn't take kindly to his property going missing. I am not his property, Lillian snapped, a flash of that fire returning to her eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Dennis's lips. Good, but he likely sees it different. He wanted to marry you, I take it. It was a question, but it felt like a test. Lillian hesitated. The full truth was a dangerous thing. She gave him the simple part, the part that wouldn't make him throw her out. My father, he passed away a few months ago. He worked for Mr. Cain. After the funeral, Mr. Cain took an interest. He decided we were to be married. When I refused, he made it clear I didn't have a choice. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. It didn't explain the sheer animal terror that had driven her into a storm. It didn't explain why Cain would send a whole posse after one reluctant bride. Dennis seemed to accept it, though his gaze remained probing. So you ran. I ran, she confirmed. I was trying to get to Santa Fe. I thought if I could get to the federal marshals. You wouldn't have made it, Dennis said bluntly. Cain's men would have had you before you cleared the basin. They're probably still out there now, scouring every canyon. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She pulled the blanket tighter. Dennis saw it. He rose and ladled a bowl of thick rabbit stew, setting it on a crate next to her cot. Eat, he commanded again. Strength is the only currency that matters out here. For the next few days, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the cabin. Lillian got her strength back, and she worked. She mended her torn dress. She learned to cook on his stove. She kept the cabin tidy with a fierceness that suggested she was battling back the chaos of her life, one swept floorboard at a time. Dennis was a creature of routine. Up before dawn, he tended his horses, chopped wood, and worked his small plot of land. He spoke little, but Lillian started to learn his language. A slight nod meant approval. A tightening of his jaw meant he was thinking of something far away. He was always watchful, constantly scanning the ridgelines, his Winchester never far from his hand. He never pushed for more of her story, and she was grateful. But the space between them was filled with unspoken questions. Sometimes she would watch him when he thought she wasn't looking, and she'd see a shadow pass over his face, a deep and abiding sorrow that he kept locked away. One night a scream tore through the cabin. It was Danish. He'd thrashed himself awake, his breathing ragged, his face pale with sweat. Buck whined and nudged his master's hand. Lillian was on her feet in an instant, a poker from the hearth in her hand. What is it? Are they here? Dennis sat on the edge of his bedroll, his head in his hands. He took a few deep, shuddering breaths. The mask of the stoic homesteader was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. A dream, he rasped, an old one. She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the table. The kind that feels more real than waking. He nodded, not looking at her. I was a ranger down on the Pecos. Got word a gang was hitting homesteads, led by a ruthless man named Riggs. We were a day behind them. We found the Dorson place, or what was left of it. They hadn't just robbed them. He trailed off, the memory too ugly for words. They burned it, with the family inside. I can still hear the mother screaming for her children. His voice was a low, tormented whisper. We tracked them for 3 days, caught up to them in a box canyon. We got most of them. But Riggs, he was clever. Used the chaos to slip away. I had a shot, a clear shot, but I hesitated, just for a second, and he was gone. I let him go. Lillian listened, her heart aching for this broken man. She understood the shadows in his eyes now. He wasn't just a man who had seen violence. He was a man who blamed himself for failing to stop it. You can't save everyone, Dennis, she said softly. You save the ones you can, he countered, his voice hard as flint again. That's the only rule that matters, and I broke it. Meanwhile, 20 miles east, in a sprawling adobe ranch house, Bartholomew Cain swirled a glass of brandy. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with cold, calculating eyes. He radiated power and absolute control. And right now, he was not in control. Nothing? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. A big man with a weathered face stood before him, hat in hand. This was Riggs, his chief enforcer. Mr. Cain, the storm washed out everything. It's like she vanished. We've checked every homestead from here to the mountains. No one's seen her. She is not a spirit, Riggs. She is a woman. Women leave tracks. They make mistakes. She has something that belongs to me, and I want it back. Cain's voice dropped, losing its cultured veneer, revealing the predator beneath. Her father, Walter, thought he could be clever. He thought he could document my affairs and threaten me. A fatal miscalculation. He took a sip of brandy. Lillian has his nerve, and she has his ledger. His eyes narrowed into slits. Find the girl, find the ledger. I don't care what you have to do, who you have to lean on. Burn the entire territory to the ground if you have to, but find her. Riggs nodded. There is one place we ain't checked proper. That old ranger's homestead up in Pine Valley. McGregor. Cain's eyes narrowed further. The recluse. Why there? The day after the storm, one of my boys, young Billy, was scouting the western ridge. He found this. Riggs reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, mud-stained piece of fabric. It was dark blue silk, tangled on a branch not a mile from McGregor's cabin. Could be a coincidence. Bartholomew Cain stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land he considered his kingdom. I don't believe in coincidences, Riggs. A man who wants to be left alone is a man who is either running from something or hiding something. Pay Mr. McGregor a visit. Be polite. At first, the air in Pine Valley grew heavier. It wasn't just the late summer heat, it was tension, a feeling that the peace they had was as thin and fragile as ice over a deep river. Dennis worked tirelessly, but his eyes were never still. He was watching, waiting. He knew they would come. It was only a matter of when. Lillian felt the dread too. She saw the way his hand drifted to his Colt when a twig snapped in the woods. His quiet protection was a comfort, but it was also a constant reminder of the danger she had brought to him. The guilt was a physical thing, a knot in her stomach. She had given him a half-truth, and now this good, haunted man was putting his life on the line for it. The breaking point came on a blistering afternoon. Dennis was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat in the quiet valley. Lillian was hanging laundry when she saw him, a lone rider, a black silhouette against the bright sky on the eastern ridge. He wasn't moving, just sitting on his horse, watching. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the wet shirt and ran toward Dennis, her voice a strangled cry. Dennis! The ridge! He didn't need to look. He'd seen the rider minutes ago. He simply embedded his axe in the chopping block and wiped the sweat from his brow. His face was a grim mask. Go inside, Lillian, he said, his voice low and even. Lock the door. Stay away from the windows. It's them, she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. It's Cain's men. It's one man, Dennis corrected. A scout. He wants us to know he's there. He wants us to be afraid. He looked at her, his gaze intense. Are you? Yes. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. He picked up the Winchester that was leaning against the woodpile. Now get inside. She did as he said, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She peeked through a small crack in the shutters, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dennis didn't take cover. He just stood by the woodpile, rifle held loosely in his hand. A clear, defiant challenge. I'm here. I'm not hiding. The rider on the ridge watched for another 10 minutes, a silent, ominous sentinel. Then as slowly as he appeared, he turned his horse and vanished over the rise. The immediate threat was gone, but the message had been delivered. They were found. That night, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. They ate their meal without a word, the unspoken tension a third person at the table. Finally, Lillian couldn't bear it any longer. She put down her fork. I didn't tell you everything, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Dennis leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I know. His simple response disarmed her. A man like Cain doesn't turn a territory upside down for a reluctant bride, he said. There's more. There's always more. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. I should have told you from the start. I was afraid you'd turn me out, that it would be too much. It might be, he said honestly. Try me. She took a deep breath, and the story she had held so tightly finally spilled out. My father, Walter Mayfair, wasn't just an employee of Mr. Cain's. He was his bookkeeper, his accountant. My father was a meticulous, honest man. At first, he believed Cain was a great man, building a future. But then he started to see things. Discrepancies, payments to men with no names, deeds to ranches signed over under duress, water rights diverted illegally. Cain wasn't building a future. He was stealing one. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. My father started keeping a second set of books, a small leather ledger where he documented everything, every crime, every name, every date. He was going to take it to the U.S. Marshals in Santa Fe. But Cain found out. He came to our house with one of his men. He demanded the ledger. My father refused. Lillian's voice broke. Cain had his man beat my father. They told everyone he'd fallen from his horse. A tragic accident. But I was there. I was hiding in the pantry. I saw it all. After they left, I found the ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study, right where he told me he'd keep it safe. She looked at Dennis, her expression a mixture of grief and fierce resolve. It's not me he wants, Denish. It's this. She reached into the lining of her mended dress and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a slim, leather-bound book. This ledger is the proof. It's the only thing that can bring him down. That's why I was running. Not from a marriage. From a murderer. Denish sat forward, his eyes fixed on the ledger. He understood the scale of it now. This wasn't a personal dispute. This was a war for the soul of the Simmeron territory. The man who was with Cain, Denish asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The man who hurt your father. What did he look like? He was big, Lillian said, shivering at the memory. A hard face, a scar that ran down his left cheek, from his eye to his jaw. He had a cold, dead look in his eyes. Denish felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows in the corners deepening. The ghost he'd been running from for 3 long years had just walked right into his cabin. Riggs! Denish breathed the name like a curse. Lillian stared at him. You know him? He's the man I told you about, Denish said, his voice a low growl of self-loathing and white-hot fury. The man who led the raid on the Dorson family. The man I let get away. The pieces crashed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't 2 separate events, 2 separate failures. It was one long, dark story, and he was tangled right in the middle of it. His past wasn't just haunting him. It had hunted him down. His failure to stop Riggs years ago had allowed the man to continue his reign of terror, to take Lillian's father, to become the iron fist of a tyrant like Cain. He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his hands clenched into fists. The quiet homesteader was gone. The Texas Ranger was back. The cold, calculated fury filled his eyes. This was no longer just about protecting Lillian. This was about atonement. This was about finishing a job. He stopped pacing and looked at her. For the first time, she saw no sorrow in his eyes, no ghosts. She saw a cold, hard purpose. He's not just your enemy anymore, Lillian, Denish said, his voice like bones grinding together. He's mine. He looked from her to the ledger in her hands and then to the door. Cain and Riggs made a mistake. They followed you here. They brought their war to my front door. They think they've cornered you. He picked up his gun belt from its peg and began strapping it on, the familiar weight of the Colt settling on his hip. They haven't, he finished, his voice ringing with grim finality. They've cornered me. The next morning, the valley felt different. The air was charged. The quiet was no longer peaceful, but predatory. Denish was no longer just a homesteader. He was a strategist. The decision was made. No more running. The stand would be made here, in this valley, on this land. But he knew they couldn't do it alone. Cain had money and men. Denish had a rifle, a pistol, and a woman with a ledger. It wasn't enough. You need to ride out, Lillian said, watching him check the loads in his Winchester. You need to take the ledger and get to Santa Fe. I'll stay here. They want the book, not the bait. Denish shook his head, not looking up. No. First, they'd get the truth of its location out of you one way or another. Second, Cain would have riders watching every trail to Santa Fe. I'd be shot out of the saddle before I got 10 miles. He finally looked at her, his winter sky eyes holding hers. And third, I'm not leaving you. The finality in his voice silenced her protest. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign and yet so welcome after months of terror. It was the feeling of not being alone. So what then? She asked. We can't fight a dozen men ourselves. No, Denish agreed, but Cain's power is built on fear. You take away the fear, the whole rotten structure comes down. There are people in redemption, good people that Cain has wronged. He's squeezed them, stolen from them, threatened them. They hate him, but they're too scared to stand up alone. You think you can convince them? I have to try, he said. I'm riding to redemption, not to the town square, but to one man. If I can convince him, we might have a chance. He slung a saddlebag over his shoulder. Barricade the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Use the shotgun if you have to. You know how. She nodded, her expression grim. Point and pull the trigger. That's the idea. He paused at the door. Lillian, this is my fight now too. You understand? She gave him a small, determined smile. I understand. Be careful, Denish. He mounted his sturdy buckskin and rode out, not along the main trail, but through the dense woods and rocky game trails he knew like the back of his hand. He moved like a ghost, his years as a ranger serving him well. He skirted the town of Redemption and made his way to a small, isolated house on its outskirts. This was the home of Brodie Jones. Brodie had once been the sheriff of Simmeron County, a man of legendary integrity. But years of fighting a losing battle against corruption, culminating in Cain's complete takeover, had left him weary. He'd retired or been forced out, and now lived a quiet life. Dennis found him in his yard mending a fence. Brodie was older, his hair white and his shoulders stooped, but his eyes, when he looked up, were as sharp as ever. "McGregor," Brodie said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Don't see you down from your mountain perch often. Don't tell me you've come to get sociable." "Not today, Brodie," Dennis said, dismounting. "I've come to ask you to break the law." "Koa." Brodie's eyebrows shot up. "Cain's law, you mean, son? Everything a good man does in this territory breaks Cain's law. What's the trouble?" For the next hour, standing in the hot sun, Dennis laid it all out. Lillian Mayfair, her father's murder, Riggs, and the ledger. He watched Brodie's face, saw the old lawman's hands clench on the fence post, saw the spark of the old fight rekindle in his tired eyes. When Dennis finished, Brodie was silent for a long time, staring toward the town he used to protect. "Cain," he finally said, the name thick with disgust. "I always knew he was a snake. I just never had the proof to hang him. And Riggs, I remember when you rode in after that business with the Dorsons. I saw what it did to you." "This is a chance to make it right, Brodie," Dennis urged. "For the Dorsons, for Walter Mayfair, for this whole territory." "It's suicide, Dennis," Brodie said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's you, me, and the girl against Cain's private army." "Not just us," Dennis countered. "What about Daniel Weaver, the blacksmith? Cain stole his grandfather's homestead claim with a forged deed. And Patrick O'Connell? Cain's men diverted the creek and dried up his pasture, forced him to sell his cattle for pennies on the dollar. They hate him as much as we do, but they need a leader. They need to know they're not alone." Brodie looked at Dennis, a long, assessing gaze. He saw the fire in the younger man, the same fire he'd once had. He sighed, a deep, rattling sound, and it felt like years of weariness were being expelled with it. "Daniel Weaver is stubborn as a mule, and Patrick O'Connell has a temper that could curdle milk," Brodie said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "They'll be a handful." He stuck out his hand. "All right, son, I'm in. Let's go kick over the anthill and see who comes running." Their first stop was the blacksmith shop. Daniel Weaver, a mountain of a man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin, listened to their story with his arms crossed, his expression grim. When they finished, he simply turned, took a brand new, perfectly balanced throwing axe from a hook, and handed it to Dennis. "My brother was a ranger," he said. "He always said you were one of the good ones. Just tell me who to hit." Patrick O'Connell, a wiry Irishman with fiery red hair, was harder to convince. He was beaten down, his spirit nearly broken. But when Brodie Jones laid out the contents of the ledger, detailing the exact date Cain had paid a man to dynamite the creek bed, O'Connell's despair turned to white-hot rage. "That murdering thief!" he roared. "I'll see him in hell for that." He grabbed a vintage Sharps rifle from over his mantle. "I've got 20 rounds for this. I'll make everyone count." By nightfall, Dennis had his army. It wasn't much. An ex-ranger, a retired sheriff, a blacksmith, and a rancher. 4 men against Cain's force, but they were men with nothing left to lose, fighting for their homes and their honor. Back at the cabin, Lillian hadn't been idle. She hadn't just barricaded the door. She'd prepared for a siege. She carried water from the spring, stacked ammunition by the windows, and familiarized herself with the shotgun. When she heard Dennis's quiet signal, the call of a whippoorwill, she eagerly unbarred the door. She was surprised to see 3 other men with him. Brodie Jones gave her a respectful nod. "Ma'am, looks like you've brought the reckoning to Redemption. We're honored to be a part of it." As the men fortified the cabin, boarding up windows and setting up firing positions, Lillian took on the role of quartermaster. She made a massive pot of coffee and stew, ensuring the men would be fed and ready. She saw the way Denish watched her, a look of pride and something deeper in his eyes. This was no longer just his fight or her fight. It was their stand. The ledger was their flag. They weren't just outlaws fighting a tyrant. They were deputies in a higher court of justice. The cabin in Pine Valley had transformed from a sanctuary into a fortress. And as the moon rose over the silent, watching ridges, they waited for the war to begin. Dawn in Pine Valley was a masterpiece of quiet beauty, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the eastern ridge, setting the dewy pines ablaze with golden light. But this morning the beauty was a cruel joke. It illuminated the figures assembling on that same ridge. At least 15 riders, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. At their head were two men, one impeccably dressed on a fine black stallion, the other a hulking shape on a powerful roan. Cain and Riggs. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat. 15, Patrick O'Connell muttered from his post at a side window, his knuckles white on his Sharps rifle. Saints preserve us. 15 men who are paid to be here, Denish said, his voice cutting through the tension. We're fighting for our homes. Don't forget that. He looked at each man. Brody, you and Patrick take the west window. Daniel, the back door. I'll take the front. Lillian, you stay low in the center of the room. Keep the ammunition ready. This is it. Lillian nodded, her face pale but her expression resolute. She had the heavy shotgun resting on a crate beside her, along with spare boxes of shells for the rifles. She was no longer a victim. She was a soldier. Outside, Bartholomew Cain raised a hand. His men dismounted, spreading out to form a wide semicircle around the cabin, using trees and rocks for cover. He had expected this. He knew McGregor was a ranger. He knew he wouldn't be taken easily. McGregor! Cain's voice, amplified by the morning quiet, boomed across the clearing. You have proven to be a considerable nuisance. I am a reasonable man. Send out the girl and the property she stole, and I will let you and your misguided friends live. Denish stepped up to the reinforced door. The only thing coming out of this cabin is justice, Cain, he yelled back. You should have stayed in Texas, Riggs. I've got a debt to pay you. A single shot from Riggs' rifle splintered the doorframe next to Denish's head. The battle had begun. The next hour was a cacophony of thunderous noise. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the sharp crack of rifles and the boom of shotguns echoing through the valley. Cain's men were professionals, advancing methodically, laying down suppressing fire. But Denish's small crew were fighting on their own ground. Daniel Weaver, the blacksmith, was a force of nature. When two of Cain's men tried to rush the back door, he kicked it open, roared like a grizzly, and hurled one of his perfectly balanced axes with terrifying accuracy, embedding it in the chest of the lead man. The second man faltered, and a blast from Weaver's shotgun sent him sprawling. From the west window, Brody and O'Connell worked like a well-oiled machine. Brody, the old sheriff, would call out targets with calm precision, and O'Connell, his rage now channeled into a cold focus, would send a heavy round from his Sharps rifle to punch through their cover. Denish was the anchor. From the front, he fired with methodical, deadly efficiency, never wasting a shot. He drove back any attempt to get close to the cabin, his peacemaker and Winchester speaking a language Cain's men understood perfectly. But they were heavily outnumbered. For every one of Cain's men that fell, two more seemed to take his place, their shots chipping away at the cabin's defenses. O'Connell cried out, clutching a shoulder as a stray bullet grazed him. Lillian crawled to him, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. Hold still, she commanded, her voice steady. Her terror had been burned away, leaving behind a core of pure steel. Riggs, seeing their defense was too strong for a direct assault, decided on a more brutal tactic. Under the cover of heavy fire, he and another man crept toward the stable, a small structure a dozen yards from the cabin. Denish saw the movement too late. The stable! He yelled. A moment later, smoke began to pour from its open door. They were trying to burn them out. The whinnies of Denish's terrified horses were a gut-wrenching sound. It was in that moment of distraction that Riggs made his move. He broke from the cover of the burning stable, sprinting directly for the cabin's blind spot on the east side, a place where the angle of the windows left a small section of the wall uncovered. He was going to breach the wall itself. Dennis swung his rifle around, but two other men opened fire, forcing him to duck back. He was pinned down. Riggs is at the east wall. Brody and O'Connell couldn't get a clear shot. Daniel Weaver was still holding the back. They were exposed. Lillian saw it all. She saw Dennis pinned. She heard the heavy thuds as Riggs began to slam his shoulder against the log wall, trying to break through a section chinked with mud and moss. She looked at the shotgun in her hands. She looked at the east wall. There was no window, but there was a small gun port, barely large enough for a rifle barrel that they hadn't been using. Without a second thought, she crawled toward it. The noise was deafening. The smell of gunpowder and smoke thick in her throat. She pushed the barrel of the heavy shotgun through the port. Through the narrow slit, she could see him. Riggs, his back to her, preparing for another charge at the wall. It was the same broad back, the same man she had seen standing over her father's broken body. A cold, cleansing rage filled her. This was for her father. This was for the Dorsons. This was for Dennis. She pulled both triggers. The roar of the shotgun inside the small cabin was apocalyptic. The double load of buckshot tore through the wooden wall at close range, hitting Riggs squarely in the back. He was thrown forward, a guttural cry ripped from his throat before he collapsed in a heap, motionless. The sudden, shocking death of his chief enforcer seemed to break the will of Cain's men. Their firing faltered. From his vantage point, Cain saw Riggs fall. He saw his attack crumbling. His face, usually a mask of cold control, twisted into a snarl of pure fury. Drawing his own silver-inlaid pistol, he stood up from behind his cover. "Useless fool!" he screamed, and began firing wildly at the cabin. It was the opening Dennis had been waiting for. With the suppressing fire diminished, he stepped into the doorway, brought his Winchester to his shoulder, and took a steady bead on the one man who started it all. For a split second, their eyes met across the bullet-scarred clearing. Cain, the tyrant whose world was collapsing, and Dennis, the man who had found his redemption. Dennis's rifle cracked once. Bartholomew Cain staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark red stain blooming on his pristine white shirt, then dropped his pistol and crumpled to the ground. A stunned silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the burning stable and Patrick O'Connell's pained groans. The remaining gunmen, their leaders dead, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. It was over. Brody and Daniel herded the prisoners while Dennis went to O'Connell, quickly assessing his wound. "It's clean through. You'll live, you stubborn Irishman." Dennis then turned and looked at Lillian. She was still on the floor, the heavy shotgun lying beside her, her face smudged with soot. He walked over and knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. They were trembling now, the adrenaline finally leaving her. "You did it, Lillian," he said softly. "You ended it." She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering. "We ended it." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tightly as the weight of what they had just survived settled upon them. He breathed in the scent of her hair, smoke and cordite, and something that was just her, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He looked over her shoulder at the valley. His valley, now quiet and safe. He saw the surviving horses that had been freed from the stable grazing nervously. He saw the sun rising higher, promising a new day. And he saw Lillian, the woman in his arms. The woman who had brought a war to his doorstep and given him a reason to fight it. He had looked at her that first night and seen his future. Now in the aftermath of blood and fire, he knew what that future was. It wasn't just about peace and quiet anymore. It was about building something, a home, a life, a place where the ledger of the past was finally balanced and a new one could begin. The fall of Bartholomew Cain, brought about by the courage of a few good people and the irrefutable truth of a simple leather ledger, sent shock waves through the region. The town of redemption was reborn, this time in spirit as well as in name. Brody Jones, with a fire reignited in his soul, pinned on a new badge, and began the long work of rebuilding a community based on justice, not fear. For Dennis and Lillian, the battle was over, but their story was just starting. They found more than just safety in each other's arms. They found a shared strength, a partnership forged in fire and loyalty. Their love story wasn't written in whispered sonnets, but in shared resolve, quiet understanding, and the promise of every sunrise over their peaceful valley. If this story of redemption, courage, and the untamed heart of the American West resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share it with a friend who loves a real tale of grit and destiny. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories from the frontier to share with you. Tales of legendary lawmen, unsung heroes, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to build a future in a wild land. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, and we'll see you on the next Dusty Trail.